I saw killers with blank masks, and I don't know what to do now. Written and read by Red Bad Andy. Let me start by saying I had never seen someone killed before in my entire life. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case. What I witnessed at several locations has scared me and left an indelible impression on any feeling of safety or security I may have previously taken for granted. 3 people in just as many nights have been killed, and I don't believe the police will find the suspects. I can scarcely believe they were human, with the way they moved and the emotionless and methodical way they went about the task of the destruction of human life. I can still see the terrible masks they wore when I closed my eyes. At least I hope they were just masks. The fact that I laid eyes on them and am still alive at all is a small miracle, though how much longer I am remains to be seen. I only share this story reluctantly as I do, to see if anyone might know anything more about these mysterious and lethal individuals, and who they might be or what they might want. Also to see if indeed any other witnesses may yet be alive. I need to know for my own sake and sanity, as well as trying to safeguard and warn others of what this might be. The first night I encountered them, I was at a gas station out close to the I-5 exit. I was filling up my car and decided to go inside the mobile station, get some snacks and a drink since I had a bit more of a drive to get home after going to see some family up north. It was about 11 o'clock at night, and when I stepped inside it was fairly devoid of other patrons. Just one nervous-looking man at the counter who winced when I stepped in, but seemed to adjust his glasses and stare at me, visibly relaxing as he saw who I was, or perhaps was not. He coughed out an unenthusiastic "welcome, let me know if you need any help," and resumed staring outside as if expecting some unseen threat to come in at any moment. I thought it was a little odd, but I started perusing the shelves and seeing if they had any of my favorite snacks to take on the road back home. I still had about an hour of driving left and hadn't eaten since dinner about 4 hours ago. As I was holding a bag of combos and a bag of Cheez-Its, considering which I might prefer, I heard the attendant let out a startled cry and dash away from the register, half tripping over a display of energy drinks. He looked like he had seen a ghost, and just blew past me, leaving me unattended in the station while he fled to the back room. I heard a click, which must have been the door being locked, and I was more than a little confused and scared by the sudden turn of events. I tried not to freak out, but I didn't know what the hell was going on. I slowly walked towards his nearest window, close to the door, and peered outside. Standing near my car was a group of 4 people. Each was wearing what appeared to be an oddly colored, but otherwise featureless, plain face mask. They did not appear to be holding anything, and their hands lay at their sides. The sight alone was deeply unnerving. They did not speak a word, but merely started moving in unison from where they stood towards the station door. I fell back from the window, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. Were these robbers just trying to take down the gas station and leave? Or was it something more sinister? I didn't want to be here to find out, but I didn't know how I could leave just then without being seen. I decided, even though I felt like it was a terrible idea at the time, to try and hide in a small narrow spot between the bathroom door and a magazine rack. It felt exposed, and I didn't know what else to do, so I hid and held my breath as I heard the front door open and the entry chime sound. I heard their heavy footfalls all moving in lockstep, in an otherwise disturbing, eerie silence. From what I saw, not even sign or body language was used to communicate between them. They just marched on methodically to the backroom door. There was a long pause in silence. Then a faint knocking on the backroom door was followed by terrified screams of the attendant. I couldn't make out everything he said from there, but I did hear him say he had called the police and they were on their way, that they could take everything from the till, just please let him go. There was no response, and after another long pause I thought they may have given up, but I heard a large crash and the splintering of wood and metal hinges, and figured they had broken the door down. The attendant was still the only person making any sound, as he wept and pleaded for his life. His attackers did not say anything, no demand, no threat. They did not accept any bribe or even the offered safe combination. The 4 silent figures had pulled the attendant out from the back room to the front of the store. The figures circled the man and pointed down at him with their index fingers in unison, still not uttering a sound. The only thing that could be heard was the soft sobbing of the attendant. That sound was cut off as one of the figures had bent down near the man and was, from the sounds of it, choking the life out of the attendant. I heard his struggling and strangled breathing, his cries for help and the wheezing desperation in his voice. I felt terrified and guilty since I knew I was unarmed and equally helpless against these terrible blank-faced attackers. I could not even call for help since I left my phone in the car. I hoped the attendant had been able to call the police, but no siren sounded in the distance, and it may have been an empty threat if the alarm was up front or if something happened to the phone line there. After what felt like ages, the struggling and gasping of the attendant stopped. The figures stood up, and without saying a word to each other, without taking anything, and without any other consideration, proceeded to leave back the way they had come from. After peeking outside to make sure they were gone, I stood up and approached the body of the man on the ground. I stopped over and checked his pulse just in case. He was dead. I had meant to, but I accidentally rolled him over while trying to step over him, and his terrified and swollen face looked back up at me. I almost fell back and tripped when I saw a strange metallic glint on the ground by his head. Without thinking about the possible incriminating action this might be, I bent down and retrieved the item on the ground. It was a piece of thick-gauge wire, sort of like the type used in pianos. I looked back down at the man on the ground and saw a slim line along his neck. These people had evidently strangled him with this piano wire. I realized with dawning horror that the men had left, and I was alone with this body, a murder weapon, and no other living witnesses. Then I made the first big mistake. I took the wire, since I assumed it had my fingerprints on it now, and I left the scene before anyone else, authority or otherwise, could show up. That terrible scene was just the first night. I agonized all night when I had gotten home on what to do. I had just witnessed a cold-blooded murder, but now I was terrified that I would be the suspect, since I still had the lethal wire in my possession. My story sounded too bizarre to believe. I considered that maybe they had cameras that might help prove my innocence and show these bizarre men in those blank masks. Unfortunately, a night later, when hearing of the murder on the news, it was indicated that there was no known suspect since the video footage of the event was disrupted somehow and the police had no way to identify the killers. This made up my mind, since I would sound like a lunatic and have no proof it was not me if I came forward. So I swallowed my guilt and tried to put the horrific event behind me. The following night, my worst fears came true, and I saw them again. I was at my apartment, and I was going out to check my mailbox at around 5 p.m. I had just gotten to the mailboxes and was fumbling with my key in the bad lighting when something caught my attention in the corner of my eye. I almost let out a scream when I saw one of the blank-faced men standing near the main office, utterly motionless. I did not know if he was looking at me or something else with that mask, but I was paralyzed with fear all the same. As I stood statue still and holding my breath, I saw another two appear on the other side of the office building, taking up positions next to the door. I was beginning to have a terrible flashback to the night, and I felt I knew what was going to happen next. My fears were validated when I saw them move in lockstep to crowd around the main office door. My heart sank when I realized that our apartment's manager, Alice, was still in there, would normally be finishing up work and locking up around 6 p.m. There were two loud knocks on the door and a pause, followed promptly by Alice's scream, as she had finally seen who was calling on her. I couldn't stand it this time. I couldn't watch it happen again. Against all my own survival instincts, I leapt forward and shouted at the four figures looming in the doorway. "Stop! Get away from her!" I stood there transfixed in my suicidal attempt at bravery, partly looking around to see if some of the other tenants might come out and help or call the police. The subsequent silence was deafening, and after an agonizingly long pause, one of the figures turned to regard me. I swallowed hard, but tried to not look away when it began staring directly at me. The other three began moving back to the door, and in the next moment had kicked the door down in unison. I heard the terrified scream of Alice again. I broke into a run, charging towards the one in front of me. My attempt was short-lived, however. Somehow, as I was running towards him, he had moved like a blur and was next to me instead of in front of me. I could barely blink before I registered his arm was outstretched with a clenched fist, and I was violently clotheslined off my feet onto the hard ground. I was almost knocked out by the impact, and my eyes tried to focus through the pain in my head. I saw the man staring down at me. He did not strike again, and capitalize on my vulnerability. He just stood there, staring down at me. After a moment, he moved into the office, and once again, I heard sobbing and pleas for mercy, cut off with a terrible strangling sound. And I knew they were garroting Alice in the same fashion as that gas station attendant. I tried to stand up. I needed to get them to stop, and couldn't stand to be witness to another of the killings. As I almost succeeded in forcing myself to my feet, I was smashed on the back of the head by something and lost consciousness. I woke up an indeterminate amount of time later in complete darkness. The smell was terrible, and I realized I had been thrown into the dumpster of my apartment complex. I pulled myself through the mire of garbage up to the top of the container and managed to extricate myself from the dumpster, landing badly on my side with a thud. I let out a pained groan but tried to ignore the blistering headache and body pain I was suffering while I got to my feet and looked around. I couldn't see anyone, and I shambled over to the office building. The lights were still on inside, but no one was there. I held my breath and I stepped further inside, and to my horror, but unfortunately not my surprise, I found Alice. She had been strangled just like the gas station attendant, and next to her head was a small piece of piano wire. I ran back home in a blind panic. I couldn't believe it had happened again. Why were they doing this? Was there any reason? After several hours, I saw the police arrive out my window. I didn't know what took them so long or why no one else had been outside when all this had happened. I resolved to tell them what I knew and offer the 2 pieces of wire I found as what would hopefully be perceived as proof. I approached the officer as the officer was furiously yelling into his radio. "This is Harris. Respond. I need backup. We have a homicide here. Will anyone respond?" He turned around from his failed attempts at summoning backup and drew his gun and pointed it at me, shouting, "Freeze!" I raised my hands in the air and shouted back, "Don't shoot!" I began telling the officer of what I had seen and showed him the wire. He was skeptical and kept getting distracted by his inability to get a signal to call for help. It was strange because we had never had reception problems here before, cell, radio, or otherwise. As he was taking my statement, I abruptly stopped mid-sentence and my mouth fell slack. I had to rub my eyes because I couldn't process what I was seeing. He noticed my pause and asked if everything was all right. Before I could stammer out a warning, a blank-faced person had a wire wrapped around the officer's neck and proceeded to strangle him right in front of me. The officer's eyes bulged, and he tried to fight back and reach for his pistol or stun gun. The figure was able to effortlessly hold him up off his feet and choke him out while barely moving. When the officer kicked, elbowed, and tried to fend him off, he looked at me pleadingly, and I once again tried to help. I sprang forward and tried to pull the blank-faced assassin off the officer. As I stepped closer, I don't know how I knew, but I instinctively ducked as a savage blow leveled at my head had just missed me from behind. I turned around and saw another blank-faced man staring at me. I wasted no time and lunged back towards the one choking the officer and tried to punch the man in the face. My arm barely made it an inch forward before I realized the third blank-faced man had seized it and held it in place. Once again, no words, no other motion, just a blank stare from the featureless masks was all I saw. "You can't do this!" I screamed, but none of them responded. My desperate cry was only answered by the increased gasping and choking sound coming from the officer. The next moment, I was again cracked on the head and fell unconscious. I woke up several hours later. To my disbelief, I was in my own bed this time. "How the hell had this happened?" I said out loud to myself. I felt nauseous and had a massive headache. I touched the back of my head and a small amount of blood was on my hand where I had touched it. I looked out my bedroom window and saw the police car was gone. Oddly, no one was in or around the office. I didn't know what the hell had happened. At that point, I actually considered that this might have been a terrible dream. But as I laughed out loud, I saw on my nightstand near my bed something that terrifies me still. Something that I hope no one else has seen. And if they have, please tell me what happened to you, or better yet, how to get rid of them. What I saw was a small piece of piano wire lying there, with a small tinge of blood near the center. And resting near it, there was an oddly shaped and featureless mask.